when I was asked to be the geography president for the British Science Festival and to give the presidential address, I was quite taken aback. After all, in the UK context, science does not often include social science, and geography as a discipline can be seen as separating physical sciences from more human-orientated studies. In other words, I was expecting them to ask one of my colleagues. Yet at its heart, geography is about people and place. And my starting point is that we can't understand people, politics, social relations, power, and inequalities without engaging with space and place. Conversely, examining place without engaging with social differences and power relations negates how place is formed and made meaningful. For my work, the specific area that I'm interested in is sexualities and genders. These are both central to our everyday lives. After all, most in this room will define themselves as men or women, with consequences for things like employment, use of public space, expectations in the home, and so on. Similarly, sexuality is often premised on binaries of men and women. After all, there wouldn't be gay or straight if we didn't have men or women. It also plays a key category in where we go and do not go, our perceptions of safety, our experiences of employment, and how we move through different everyday spaces. Focusing on lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, and queer lives not only offers insights into the experience of marginalized groups, it also highlights hegemonies that others experience as normal or ordinary. In our book, Ordinary in Brighton, Layla Bakshi and I explored the power of what it meant to be ordinary and how ordinariness might indeed be a political and personal goal that moves us beyond the need to conform to other people's normal. Holding on to these local and familiar and everyday spaces, but exploring this at a transnational level, this paper examines the legislative changes in relation to sexual and gender identity equalities in three ways. So I'm going to explore equalities legislation through its implementation in Great Britain. And I specifically say Great Britain because Northern Ireland is obviously a different legislative context. Explore how legislative inclusions are perceived and experienced, and then I'll investigate one of the political outcomes of the presumption of legislation as a panacea to LGBT marginalizations. This is the creation of a legitimate sexual and gendered politics elsewhere through the denial of the need for them here. I won't go into the methodologies that I used, although I'm happy to discuss them afterwards. In short, we used a transnational feminist queer methodology, and what we did was try to move beyond comparative examinations in order to examine livable lives in geographically nuanced ways. What this means is we allowed the context to create the methods rather than imposing methods on different contexts. So not scientific in the true sense at all. We focused on England, where in 2015 legislation had just come into place that created same-sex marriage, and India, where in 2015 Penal Code 377, which prohibited unnatural sexual acts, and a relic of British colonialism, was reinstated. These diverse legislative contexts enables us to examine what makes life livable for LGBTQ people in places where we were supposed to be accepted by the state, and somewhere that ostensibly penalised those who practice unnatural sexual acts. We increasingly see maps like this one that indicate where there are supposed to be good and bad nations that are premised on laws that protect lesbians and gay men, mainly, and that sometimes bi and trans people. Great Britain does very well. However, legislation can be partial and does not indicate how these laws are implemented. So we decided to explore how the Equality Act 2010, which is an Equality Act that's celebrated, it's supposed to be world-leading, world-beating, it names sexual orientation and gender identity as protected characteristics, but how was it enacted? So I do need to give you some details of how we found out how it was enacted. So the legislative demands of the Equalities Act 2010 were most clearly spelled out for public sector organisations in a set of guidelines by the Government Equalities Office. So these were the duties that were set out, and as you'll see, they were very limited, and this coincided with the advent of the coalition government. So the Equalities Act was introduced under Labour, coalition government came in and were supposed to implement it. What they suggested that local authorities do is they set and publish a set of measurable equality objectives and deadlines. They don't have to meet these objectives, note, they just have to publish them, and publish information to show compliance with equalities duty at least annually. That's it. That's all they had to do to show compliance. We also looked at LGBT equalities in terms of LGBT-related actions, as well as those which might not clearly align to the policies themselves. So what were people doing in relation to LGBT equalities? And as you can see, we created a series of questions to examine this in a kind of quite a detailed way. We undertook 2 detailed systematic web searches and supplemented these with emails and freedom of information requests. We did one in 2014 and 2015 and one in mid-2016. What we found was quite surprising. As you can see, the majority of local councils in 2016 had moved down a category from 2014-2015. So the presumption that they were getting better, that sexual progress was increasing and that the Act was going to be implemented was false. In fact, it was going the other way. Less people were implementing the Equality Act. Now, this isn't just about LGBTQ. This is simply, have you published a set of measures? What are you going to do? And have you published any information? And the answer was generally over half of councils in 2016 had not done that. There was some evidence that austerity was an issue. Both Norwich City Council and Leicester City Council made explicit reference to austerity and recent cuts as having an impact on equalities, but other councils very blatantly and openly said that they didn't want to do equalities work. So Ribble Valley Council responded to the equality duty by presenting, and this is all they did, a common misunderstanding about the equality duty webpage. So they didn't have any equality duties measures, but they did have a web page that told you what the misunderstandings about the equality duty were. Other local councils similarly took pains to emphasise what they were not supposed to do. So Hamble Council said there's no longer a requirement to undertake a formal EIA, which is an equality impact assessment. So at Hambleton, we operate a system of embedded equality consideration across all our services. In other words, we're not paying any attention to it at all. Should it be necessary, and always mindful of data sensitivity and other confidential issues, this can be made available to the relevant parties through the consultation process. Now, you will note that actually their duty was to publish a set of objectives and then to publish data. So this is actually in direct kind of conflict with what they were supposed to be doing. And the absence of data was very clear here. What was also important is what the duty, or what the duty set out to do, was to force marginalised and excluded communities to approach councils for data, to then, or to get the data from the council's website, as was expected to happen, to then analyse the data and come back with problems. The presumption there being that these marginalised communities have enough resources to access the data, to do data analysis, to pull out what the problem is, etc., etc. And then on top of that, that if the council wasn't achieving, that a majority would vote against that council because it wasn't achieving minority rights, which are all massively problematic assumptions. It's clear that this council sees themselves as undertaking less work because of the Equality Act 2010. So when equality-related processes in local authorities can be reduced to tick-box exercises without significant impact on localised marginalised communities, which is what the GEO guidance pretty much did, the emphasis appears to be on reducing workload. So how that gets put into place is through reducing workload, addressing accusations of political correctness, and indeed treating everyone the same. But the basis of the Equality Act 2010 was to protect the rights of individuals and advance equality of opportunity for all. And that was underpinning the Act. It's clear then that the Equality Act was far from universally implemented. Indeed, even though the guidance was based on the assertion that the public would hold the public sector and local government to account, it's clear from our data that and the responses we received that very few local governments were publishing appropriate data in accessible ways. In other words, even the watered-down legislation was not implemented effectively across England. And this poses fundamental questions to measures of progress that are based on legislation. Focusing specifically on LGBT work, only 20 councils, 6% of all councils, had equalities objectives specifically related to LGBT people. And these were primarily objectives to develop better relationships with LGBT communities, to establish particular LGBT groups, and to tackle LGBT-related bullying. Only one council had a specific objective related to trans people. The number of local councils that published information relating to employees' sexual orientations, which was supposedly a key means of implementing the Act, dropped from 39% in 2014 to 2015 to 33% in 2016. And this may be because there was an overall drop in workforce monitoring data, but it shows that you can ignore an issue by avoiding collecting data. Indicating the disjointed implementation of the equalities legislation, it also questioned a focus solely on implementing the criteria that we established. And 55% of the councils who did not meet the criteria of full compliance did publish some information about their work they were doing with LGBT people. So even if they weren't compliant with the legislation, some of them were doing work around LGBT equalities. But almost a third of councils were only taking limited action, such as promoting LGBT History Month or hosting an LGBT section in their local library. Again, this questions the ideals of progress created through legislation and offers an empirical evidence of the need to move beyond legislative equalities when examining sexual and gendered as well as broader equality progress. Moreover, it supports the assertion that the world is not one because legislations are in place. Presuming that the fight in Great Britain is now over and the focus that should be elsewhere is something I'll address later. In contrast to equalities work and linking directly to debates regarding homonormativity, of the 153 councils who provide marriage services, 41 eligible councils in 2015-2016 were lacking details that they should have had on there about same-sex marriage. This changed, and in 2016, only 16% of those councils were lacking that data. In other words, whilst they weren't doing work on LGBT equalities, they were making sure that the same-sex marriage information was on their website and supporting same-sex marriage. What this suggests is that the difficult work of LGBT equalities is ignored whilst you get on with the fun celebration of same-sex marriage. And it demonstrates, obviously, an inconsistency in relation to LGBTQ issues and reveals that while some legislation is widely celebrated and implemented, other work that's more complex, more difficult, and potentially more resource intensive, and of course doesn't bring in money, like marriages do, can be overlooked. So, looking at then the experiences of legislation and transnational perspectives, whilst the equalities legislation is relied upon by those seeking to differentiate between homophobic or not homophobic countries, this legislation, even in one of the supposedly most progressive of countries in England, may not be implemented through key institutions like local government. This calls into question the reliance on legislation on the statute book and shows the need to go beyond equalities. We are proposing that the idea of livability enables this move. So what do we mean by livability or livable lives? So livable lives are lives that are more than just bearable. They transgress normative routes to happiness. This comes from Judith Butler, who proposed the question, what counts as a life? In order to throw critical light on the value of human lives. What do we consider human? And which lives count and which do not? According to Butler, the good life is available and or granted to only those lives who are already possible. The notion of a livable life deals with figuring out ways to survive and persist, to become possible, but it also moves beyond this, towards understanding what it is to have a good life. So legislation and recognition are a part of this, because to achieve a good life, one must be firstly recognised as having a life. In the Livable Lives project, what we sought to do was explore how legislation played a part in livabilities, in making a life, without presuming that legislative acceptance necessarily created livabilities. For activists and others, we wanted to explore the place of legislative equality in creating social change, not to dismiss it, as might be read in some of the queer critiques, but instead to understand the possibilities as well as the limitations of legislative change. So what this section will do is show what makes what makes life livable is always dependent on context, and legislative context is important to this, but it's not determined by it. So the framing of livability enables an exploration of the enactment of legislation, illustrating that whilst recognition may not be afforded locally, even if it's given nationally, and of course vice versa. Yet the importance of legislation, as well as its limitations, is clear when asking LGBT people what makes life livable or not livable in India and Great Britain. So.
If you are unwell, then what keeps you so?
On a personal level, I am not unwell. On a political level, I am really unwell. Political and social saffronization is not letting me stay well. Gender discriminating social structure is also not letting me stay well. And 377. I think my sexual orientation is not something I will talk about with everybody, and neither will I want to hide it. So actually, maybe 377 is not something that waits beside my bed, but the fear is still there, that I am being forced to be something. I am pushed to carry something heavy. This pressure, these norms are what keeps me unwell.
For a number of participants from West Bengal, the political situation of Penal Code 377, the broader right-wing government, issues of gender discrimination, as well as the fear and being pushed to carry something heavy, impact livability, or in this participant's terms, what keeps them well. However, legislation in England was not seen to be enough to make life livable. Even if it might create viable lives that are possible, they may not be lives that are a life. When exploring livability, we can account for broader cultural changes as well as individual experiences of gender and sexual discrimination that might otherwise be overlooked.
Legal things changing. People can think that everything is okay just because people are married, obviously. But you're living next door to a bigot or someone who thinks it's disgusting. The issues still remain for people.
The law may have changed, but we continue to play catch-up with hearts and minds.
Figure 1, or this picture, also illustrates some key issues, a number of key issues from straight people. So if you look at this quote down here, straight people often think that LGBTQ people are now equal since we are the same, since same-sex marriage, but there is a lot more to it. And then moving on, there were 4 different quotes related to inequalities and lesbian experiences because of sexual identities and also because I am a woman. And this was all from the UK data. The presumption of legislative equality as a panacea is shown to be an illusion for these UK participants and highlights that the critique of legislative equalities goes far beyond the pages of academic journals or indeed presentations such as this. Indeed, in Figure 1, the concept of livability is highlighted as necessary. It says livability is useful because we need so much more than just the basic to simply exist. As many academics have argued, legislation does not necessarily change all LGBTQ people's lives for the better. In Sarah's words, issues remain. Equally important, positive legislation for some may result in normative violence for others. The criteria that are used to grant the status of human to one individual may deprive another individual of the same status. So Judith Butler says, I want to maintain that legitimization is double-edged. It is crucial that politically we claim intelligibility. And it is crucial, and it is crucial politically that we maintain a critical and transformative relation to the norms that govern what will and will not count as intelligible and recognizable alliance and kinship. A new normal can be created such that some who were once sexual and gender distant are now part of this new normal, leaving others who remain anti-normative and potentially more vulnerable because LGBT people are seemingly equal in the eyes of the law. So Marissa says,
this so-called progress that we make in time, I feel like it's always to the detriment of other people. So gay marriage is great, and I'm really happy it exists in some places. But what about people who don't want to get married and who don't fit that also monogamous way of living, the nuclear family as the one place in society that remains indestructible? And what does it mean if you actually consider your family a social sphere that is broader than actually the nuclear family? Then how do you make your life livable that way? In social change activism, you actually push for things, but I know that by pushing some things, I'm actually acting for the detriment of other people. It's like you're othering people by creating yourself or your group or your community as acceptable. And yeah, I find it really hard to accept.
Marissa and others in England noted that same-sex marriage legislation is core to the supposed societal acceptance for some. Their happiness about its existence in some places was tempered against the ways in which it reconstructed normative coupled family relationships. This data pointed to the complexities of legislative inclusions, which are deeply desired and fought for in India, but do not lead to utopia or necessarily livable lives in Great Britain. The assumptions that legislative change eliminates hate crime or deals with societal acceptances have been roundly rebuked. Moreover, the normalizations inherent in legislation, such as same-sex marriage, can be read as a victory. But has long been argued these victories need to be sceptically, and as Kath Browne and others have suggested, geographically assessed. What our data points to is how transnationally LGBT people, regardless of legislative contexts, continue to be subject to humiliating and difficult experiences, often seemingly brushed off as a joke. So Heidi says,
there is homophobia in totally different ways, like at work. I always feel the need now to go into work and you're like, hi, how are you? I'm like, hi, I'm a lesbian. Let's just do that really quickly, because then it's just out there then, and then the banter can commence, where I will happily join in taking the piss out of myself, because it's easier than being like, please don't offend me, because that's really hurtful. Like I had a manager, a professional manager, referred to me always, never mind my name, but always as Leza. And I laughed at that. Like, yeah, Leza, fine, cool. But then I look back at that and I'm like, that's not fine. That's really not fine. That type of homophobia absolutely exists. As one person, you are vulnerable. You go along with it because you're like, I don't know how to challenge this in a way we don't come across as angry lesbian. You just don't want to be a stereotype because people automatically think, if you start ranting, oh, angry lesbian, man hater.
These quotes invoke the everyday realities of being other and not normal, the slow and continuous effect of being the butt of the joke. These experiences construct your daily life, such that you may not even notice. Indeed, you can presume them to be acceptance. But being the butt of the joke, whether you're involved or not, can have damaging effects. The idea of sexual or gender identity as part of the joke indicates that these differences continue to be seen. In spaces where people are ostensibly supported, there continues to be issues with who is ridiculed and how. The precarity of LGBTQ acceptances and inclusions were also highlighted by participants.
So I feel like they all feed into each other, and I do feel like, yeah, maybe there's less to fight in terms of you have less chances to get murdered in the street because you're gay. But in the meantime, there are less things I feel they're just more subtle, and people tend to give up about it because they feel like it's becoming okay. But I feel like this one is actually going to come back.
I think you're absolutely right. I think that's when people say to us about, we've got an LGBT forum, we've got Pride, why do you do that anymore? Don't need that anymore. You don't march. Okay, have a party instead. We have some people who sort of think, well, you don't need that kind of support anymore. You've got what you need. You're where you want to be, but we do need to keep an eye on things. I think we need to just watch that plate spinning on a stick and just keep that going, because as soon as we take our eyes off that, it's going to crash, and that's what worries me.
Patricia and Tim's concern that this one is actually going to come back regarding the stigmatization of LGBTQ people is a necessary addendum to the idea that there has been successful and irrevocable social, legal and political change to the benefit of all LGBTQ people in the geographic context of Great Britain. The idea that LGBTQ people don't need support and the image of the plate on a stick indicates the precarious feelings associated with legislative change, as well as challenging the experiences of legal equalities, as negating all forms of support that currently exist. It's clear that legal changes alone don't make life more livable. Conversely, the absence of legal protections did not necessarily make life not livable, such that the desire to live a life that is worth living is not always tied to the presence or absence of law. In our data, it was also tied to individual circumstance, the need for recognition, acceptance, and the presence or absence of support from family, community, and collectivities. As Subra argued,
So, my livability depends initially on this support system, and only then I can take on the structure. I cannot think about bringing structural changes all alone without any anchor. It must be on an organizational level. As important as waiting for the law to change, the government to overturn its policies, acceptance in the family. Inhabiting those small spaces, it gives us more air to breathe.
this view questions the focus on legislation to provide support systems and instead points to the place of support systems in fighting for and engaging in social change. Subra believes in breaking the heteronormative imaginings in small ways to be able to poke through holes in dominant orders, opening up spaces that might disrupt hegemonic and repressive normativities. Subra's engagement with the microspaces to create national and global change points back to the place of hearts and minds in creating social change. Creating supports that may be beyond legislation points to an important rejoinder to the limits of the implementation of legislation. Where legislation is only implemented in partial ways, as in the case with India, it's only partially being implemented. Not everyone who is having unnatural sex is being persecuted. Regressive legislation and the struggle for acceptance did not preclude livable lives. The struggle to, in Butler's terms, become possible may not create a happy life, but it may make life a livable one. So for Shamita, even a hard life can become a life that is worth living, a meaningful life.
Living is something meaningful, a meaningful life. It need not be all sunshine and puppies, but something, good or bad, that adds a new meaning to my life. Then even if I lead a hard life, it would be a life worth living for. And as for surviving, we cannot just divide life into good and bad. The world is not black and white. So surviving is the daily life I lead, a strategy to go on. I cannot live the way I want to at this moment. It's wishful to think everything will go my way whenever I want it to. But I live on hope, and that's how I survive. I ready myself and I go right back up, no matter how many times I've fallen down. So it's a positive thing for me.
Questioning the binary of living and surviving, Shamita points to how life can simultaneously be livable and bearable. A meaningful life may not be an easy life, and indeed legislative progress may hinder the creation of a meaningful life. If one's life becomes meaningless, relegated to the butt of jokes that you need to get over because you have everything you need in legislative terms. To be able to fight for social change, to be involved in political struggle can be premised on feeling safe, and this can be brought about by legal changes. Yet when this fight is seen to be won, the politics that are created in and through this fight may remove the struggle from here. Engagements with legislative acceptance, and particularly assumptions that in Tim's words, you have got what you need, can create specific forms of politics that are inherently geographical and grounded in imagined binaries between here and there. So seeing somewhere as worse than where you are can be empowering. Your life is not as bad as it might be. So on the online questionnaire, we asked, as an LGBT person, what makes your life not livable? Not much when I consider the hurt and pain LGBTs undergo on a daily basis in other countries. The hurt and pain of others seemingly dwarfs the hurt and pain that might otherwise be recognized and agitated around. This discourse becomes comparative. I am fine because they are not. This understanding is replicated in LGBTQ events in Great Britain and elsewhere, including in Brighton Pride, where in 2016 the names of other places were carried as a mark of solidarity for those who do not have what supposedly all LGBTQ people in Brighton, and indeed in Great Britain, do have. Marking places as homophobic can be read in Edward Said's terms, where these politics speak more to the self, the here, than they do to other places that are marked as other. In creating a politics that only references elsewhere, LGBTQ politics becomes synonymous with pointing out legislative and state-sponsored violence in other places. If everything is sorted here for some gay men and lesbians, then there are no problems to be addressed by us all. The assumption of the panacea of legislative equalities means that the battles here are won. And the uniting feature then becomes our support for them elsewhere. This asks for LGBTQ people and the collectives here to overlook and get over their issues and concerns, experiences and things that might make their lives not livable. Broader socio-sexual issues are no longer at stake. You have same-sex marriage, what more do you want? Sexual politics then becomes displaced elsewhere. The ongoing discriminations and marginalizations are to be ignored in favor of those poor others in other places. So again, the questionnaire, can you think of a place that makes you feel that as an LGBTQ person, your life is or may not be livable there? India is pretty high on the list, many parts of Africa, large swathes of Southeast Asia, and just Africa. The focus of this section, perhaps obviously, has been on data from the UK respondents in a place where the world has won. And LGBTQ equalities are often read as being achieved. These online responses highlight that life is perceived as not livable only in other places, where participants' imaginings create specific global sexual geographies. Entire continents become unsafe, and again reflect the dangerous and dark and exotic other places, this time through a gender and sexual lens that focus on legislation and media coverage. The geographical imaginings indicate a specific way that the assumption of winning creates a binary of here and there. This binary creates a here that is safe in contrast to a dangerous or other there. In turn, this creates an acceptable sexual politics here that is reliant on distant others who undergo pain and hurt that is not present here. In India, there was a similar move to see elsewhere as worse than here, in this case in terms of urban and rural divides. So Suprana says,
I think it's because we are in a city we can live like this. In the film, it was a village, and obviously there was not enough awareness and education, because of which there was so much problem.
There are problems with basing politics on other places and other people who need help and work, in contrast to us who are educated and can live like this. Not only can it obscure and downplay sexual and gendered politics here, when heteronormative concerns and problems are no longer valid, the problem becomes the person with the problem. This can further marginalize and exclude, individualizing problems to specific groups, such as trans people or those with mental health issues. The issues faced are, of course, crucial and central to our communities, but they are not the problems of others who fail. The problem is broader heteronormative orders that we are all subject to. This order is the unease many of us continue to feel, that the world has not been won, but it is difficult to name and often negated for places that are worse than here. Indeed, we need to investigate the continued disenfranchisement of LGBTQ people through things like health, hate crime, and microaggressions, like being the butt of jokes, incidents that might be shrugged off but can have lasting consequences. The placing of the problem elsewhere is often set in a post-colonial frame that does not acknowledge, for example, in the Indian context, the place of colonialism in creating legislation such as Penal Code 377. In doing so, it creates victims who are marginalized and in need of the global North's intervention to save them. That's not what our research pointed to. And this frame ignores how LGBTQ people find space to be themselves, to express themselves, to create their communities. Finding such places can be empowering, and there is a need to be powerful. Life isn't always livable for LGBTQ people. Perhaps the politics of mutual respect, learning and engagement, what we would term a transnational feminist queer politics, might enable LGBTQ people's lives to become more livable, more meaningful in ways that does not reduce us to helping poor others, but instead encourages us to learn and help each other. So, I often use the analogy of gender and racial inequalities to help people to understand why sexual politics have not been solved by legislative change, why gay marriage is not enough. Legislation regarding gender and racial discriminations and exclusions have been on the statute books for decades, yet few would deny that racism and sexism is still prevalent across public and private spaces. Despite this, LGBTQ people are told, and indeed themselves believe, that with the advent of same-sex marriage, we are all equal now, and that there is nothing to fight for. I believe it is important to question and challenge this false perception, and to explore ways of both recognizing the place and importance of legislative advances, as well as examining their limitations. I think that there's a problem in naming what is going on, and using livability is a means of naming what is happening. This paper has shown 3 ways why equal rights cannot be used to measure LGBTQ livabilities. Firstly, because legislation is not implemented uniformly or evenly, even in one legislative context. Because people's experience of legislation shows that it's not enough and that it can be harmful. Because it can create a politics of elsewhereness, where sexual and gendered politics here are downplayed or ignored due to the assumptions that the issues are being dealt with. Thus, while not abandoning judicial reform, activists and academics need to go beyond them to create the conditions of lives that are worth living. So I began this talk with an understanding that geography is a discipline that studies people and place, and that cannot overlook sexualities and gender in its purview. In this short time, I hope to have illustrated both how geographies are necessary for engagements with the limits and effects of LGBTQ equalities, and also how gender and sexual politics are constituted through geographies, and specifically geographical imaginings of here and there. As such, the paper presented a transnational analysis that recognizes the limits of legislative change, thus enabling a more nuanced engagement with sexual and gendered politics that move away from them and us, here and there, towards an understanding of the complexities of what makes lives livable within and beyond sexual and gendered rights. Refocusing politics away from poor others towards a reformulation of transnational communications and activisms that works across borders and seeks to create collaborations is inherently geographical. Not only this, it is necessary if we are to contest static understandings of other people in other places who need our help. So whilst legislation is important, the assumptions that equalities legislation makes countries better or worse needs to be reconsidered, along with the assumptions that in places like England, all LGBTQ lives are now livable. Transnational work is not about comparing nations, finding them to be progressive or backwards, but instead seeks to question the often post-colonial positioning of nation states. It's about disrupting the global north, global south divides and intervening in debates that hierarchize Western democracies as spaces of inclusion, while simultaneously vilifying exotic others as inherently homophobic and synonymous with backwardness. It's clear that these divides and these presumptions are shaping contemporary LGBTQ politics here and there, ignoring and individualizing ongoing marginalizations and discriminations here, while seeking to help, maybe save, there. This illustrates the mutual transnational constitution of politics, but it's not one that we might want to pursue. Our challenge instead is to consider how these transnational politics might operate differently, through mutual respect, mutual learning, and importantly, beginning from the premise that legislation is important, but it is not enough. Thank you.